Sucks, Fuck Off, overproduced by Martin Hannett, take 4.
Kia ora and welcome to PostingCast. My name's John. My pronouns are he and him.
My name's Ross. My pronouns are he or they.
And we have a guest today. We are joined by Byron Clark. Hello, Byron.
Hello.
How are you going?
I'm going pretty well, thank you.
It's been a week of things.
It really has been a week of things, yeah.
And you have been exceptionally busy. It seems like you turn on the radio, you are there. Various other platforms are asking for your comment because things have been occurring, which we are not really going to talk about first up because you spent all week talking about this stuff. And what we thought, because obviously Byron's obviously a well-known documenter of the far right, YouTuber, all-round shitposter at GC Online. And we just thought we'd get him on for a bit of a chat about stuff that necessarily doesn't end up with him getting death threats. Like, we just thought we'd be...
Well, certainly hope you don't get death threats from talking to us. That would suck.
Yeah,
someone will send one down and be like, it's the PostingCast. That's why, just to make you feel bad.
Yeah.
Look, man, we are very, very proud to become part of the vast conspiracy against many people in this country whose brains have holes in them the size of babies' fists.
Well, I'm already part of like the powerful transgender lobby. So
there you go. There'll be multiple red strings going to the PostingCast pin in that case.
For sure.
You got to get that Soros funding in. Got to buy this microphone, all this stuff.
That reminds me, it has been month end, and I need to get my invoice in for that.
Okay, so Byron, on the radio, you keep being introduced as Byron Clark, researcher in misinformation on the far right, and then they say Byron started by documenting the Occupy Christchurch movement, which was, oh God, it's not 10 years ago, it's 11 years ago. Man, we're getting
11
old.
years ago, yeah.
But obviously, that was a big project for you. I mean, it was quite a big thing to be able to document something that large that was part of a global interconnected movement. We'd love you to tell us a little bit about how you got into it.
Well, I'd studied history at university, and I didn't go down the route of being an academic historian. But you do have this thing when you study history where you can see history happening around you and you start thinking, oh no, what if nobody writes this down? So the impetus to do the oral history project on Occupy was just knowing that if I don't do this, so who else is going to? And so I went and I did a bit of extra training as an oral historian at the National Library, and I roped in pretty much as many people as I could who had participated in Occupy, who were willing to, speak and have it recorded and, have that published. And yeah, the end result of that was about 14 interviews, which all online. I've made it under a Creative Commons license. It's all available for anyone to listen to or remix into their own. If anyone ever wanted to do a documentary or whatever, they could do that. And then, ebook, and then self-published a hard copy of the book just last year. The end to a very long project. I guess it's still ongoing a little bit because I'm still working on just getting into some libraries and things. It's at the Macmillan Brown Library at the University of Canterbury now, but I want to get a few copies in the public library too, just so it's more accessible there as well.
So, also a history student here, history and American studies, and it's the same thing where you watch the news and you're like, oh, this is going in a book. There are going to be people arguing about this in about 20 years' time. There's an undergraduate essay coming out of the news I have just watched. And that seems to happen like almost every week recently.
There was an excellent tweet I saw, I guess about 7 years ago now. I think it was in the midst of Brexit and the Trump campaign. And the tweet just said, I feel like we're in a factors leading to part of the history book before everything gets all arrowy with flags.
Yeah, I remember that one. It does kind of feel, we have moved away from events leading up to, and we are now firmly into the conflict or the event.
We've moved from fuck around to find out.
We are firmly in the finding out zone. Yeah. So what? I mean, I didn't really take part in the various Occupy movements for various reasons, but what was it like at Occupy Christchurch at the time?
Well, I was there pretty much right through. I wasn't involved in any of the like planning meetings or anything that took place beforehand, which is one of the things that made it quite interesting, because I'd been involved in activism on the left prior to that. I mean, going right back to the invasion of Iraq when I was in high school and going on anti-war marches and things. So when Occupy happened, suddenly it was a group of people who weren't the usual suspects who were organizing this. So that was quite exciting. But I did go along to the initial march that they did, and didn't camp in Hagley Park that night, but I did come and camp for a bit later. I was working, I think, a couple of part-time jobs at the time, so I couldn't be there full-time. Very few people could, but I did spend enough time there to see the different phases of the camp, which I think is one thing that really comes through when you read the oral history. Starts off with this phase of a lot of idealistic young people and students, many people who are into the summer music festivals and just saw this as another one of those, who came along and had this big carnival party atmosphere, but with strong politics about inequality and so on. And it started with that and kind of moved into more of the serious political activists perhaps thinking this is something we can get involved in and have an influence in. And then the final phase was more when it had become a place where homeless people and other marginalized people had realized they could get some free food, but also be accepted and be welcome. But then along with that, it did bring a bit of antisocial behavior and things like that. So I saw it go through those three sort of phases, and I interviewed some people who had been there, through those three phases, or some who maybe came in the middle or near the end, or ducked out early, to get a range of perspectives. I tried to interview people in a way that reflected the diversity of people who were there. It's a difficult thing to do. If you ever do an oral history of a social movement, you'll probably find there'll be a lot of people, tends to be Pākehā men, who will be like, oh yes, of course I'll speak to you. I was a very important part of this. And people from other groups will just be like, oh, I wasn't one of the important people. You don't need to talk to me. And you have to convince them that their story is equally important. But I did speak to somebody who had been homeless, and somebody else who had turned up at the campsite after being discharged from a mental hospital. So I wanted to get those more marginal voices in the history as well. But then other people I talked to were, some people veteran activists who were, baby boomer age people who had been involved in activism going way back, and this was something else. And then some people who were, in their early 20s, and this was their first kind of go at doing something big and active. So yeah, an interesting thing to be a part of, and an interesting thing to document as well.
It lasted like way over 100 days as well, didn't it? It was
yeah, I mean, it went from October to March, October 2011 to March 2012, and the Christchurch one did last a little longer than the other campsites. I think the reason being that we were still in the aftermath of the earthquake when it began, so we didn't have a central square where people could go and do this occupation. I think if the occupation had been in Cathedral Square, probably the council and the police might have moved people along quicker, as they did in other cities. But because the central city was still fenced off, we were in a corner of Hagley Park, which at the start of it was where there was like a temporary bus exchange. So it was a bit of a bustling place, but it was still out of the way. We weren't on a sports field or anything there. So
yeah,
so people could just be left to their own devices by the council and whoever. And I think it went on longer because of that. And it really only ended when a lot of the original people had gone away. It was starting to get to a colder time of year. It was disproportionately at this point more marginal homeless people who did have some a tendency towards some antisocial behaviour. But it ended on a reasonably good note, though, because for some of the people there, ending it meant getting them into emergency housing or social housing. There was a former regional councillor who was involved in some capacity in Occupy, and then became kind of the negotiator with the city council, as someone who kind of had a foot in both worlds of that local government and the more kind of radical protest scene. And he was involved in some of those negotiations for, okay, we're going to move on.
Yeah.
So yeah, an interesting.
It's nice also to have a protest movement which was kind of mostly seen to have demands which were unfulfillable in terms of kind of the reform of capital and all of this sort of thing. Yet actually, you have like the Occupy movements. It was an energizing moment for some activists, especially young ones who came in, but actually like saying, oh yeah, materially we got these people into housing is it's better than not doing it. You know what I mean? It's better than other protests saying, oh yeah, we came and we demanded and we got nothing and then we all went home.
Yeah. And I think and one of the things that made me want to record that history is that there were a lot of people who, for them, this might have been their first involvement in something, and they were all going to go on and do other things. So I know one of the people I interview, who I'm still in touch with, who I did a interview with for another podcast last week, actually. Small world. So I interviewed her for the oral history, and recently she interviewed me for a podcast. But she's a bit younger than me, so Occupy was early activism for her. And then one of the things she went on to do was be one of the founding members of the Feminist Society at the University of Canterbury, which I'm not sure if that's still going now in any form, but that was a group that was active. And I think for a lot of young women a bit younger than me, that was some of their first involvement in activism. So there'll be a lot of people around now still involved in social justice movements who you can trace back to Occupy if they were someone in their early 20s and in the early 2010s.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that interests me about that, it's really fascinating talking about those different phases of the Occupy Christchurch experience is how it sort of it feels like what we've seen this month is sort of like, it's almost like a mirror image of that sort of Occupy movement.
A speed run, any percent.
Yeah, mirror universe speed run, and it's just what's that like for you, having been so involved with Occupy Christchurch, sort of seeing that not quite happen again, but
through a mirror darkly.
Yeah, well, I've been asked a little bit about comparisons, and the key thing, of course, is it's the same tactic. It's an occupation. It's not the kind of protest where everybody goes home afterwards and then can be safely ignored. It's something that is disruptive and has the goal of being disruptive. And I've said, with this, well, not really current protest anymore, but the very recent protest in Wellington, there's all sorts of reasons to condemn it and condemn the people there, but I never condemn disruption as being an inherently bad thing, because I think in a democracy you accept that there will be civil disobedience and protests that do disrupt things, and talked about strikes and things are deliberately economically disruptive, and that's part of the goal and part of the tactic. So being disruptive is not a problem. So there's that similarity there in the tactics. I think another similarity is the sort of globalized nature of protests now, and there was some talk of that as being as if it's a new thing with this current protest, because there's been a lot of interest in what's the overseas influence here, which I think can be a little overstated, because I think some people maybe want to downplay our own sort of homegrown far right extremism.
This is not us,
but this is definitely not the first globalized protest. It's just the first sort of globalized reactionary protest. Occupy, I think, perhaps, well, like even before Occupy, I mean, I think if you look at the anti-war movement in the early 2000s, that was very global very quickly, even with the kind of early 2000s internet we had, was earlier movements would be global, but they'd move around the world slower. And then since then, Black Lives Matter and Me Too, these ideas will start in one country, but they'll very quickly spread. And so when you want to have a protest in Aotearoa, if you say we're having a Black Lives Matter protest, people will go along knowing what Black Lives Matter is, knowing what the kaupapa is, and the same is true of, we're going to have a anti-vaccine convoy. If you announce you're going to have an anti-vaccine convoy, the kind of people who would attend that, know exactly what that is because they've been following the one in Ottawa or the one in Canberra. And
I guess it's interesting though what you were saying about the sort of the phases of the Occupy Christchurch. It went from being like this sort of early summer festival almost, and then it became quite a cerebral sort of political, sitting around the campfire talking about Marx or whatever. And then by the end, it had become quite marginalized and had changed focus again. And I was just thinking, we kind of saw that in Wellington, and we had the initial sort of hang 'em high nooses, which was really, I found very confronting. And then you had this, no, actually, it's all morning yoga and the Hare Krishnas are here and it's fine actually. And then by the end, it felt like
at some point the politicians or wannabe politicians arrived like vultures. So much, especially Winston Peters, who does look like he has got a large set of black wings just hiding under that suit jacket.
I guess it's also what you said about protest being disruptive, and one of the things that, again, having been, I was in the anti-war marches and stuff back in 2003, and got thoroughly disillusioned with the ability to actually change things, I think, as a result. But that sort of, it feels like protest has been neutered recently. It's this real, you can have your say, but as long as you say it very politely, and you wouldn't want to slow down traffic or prevent anything, actually cause any kind of disruption, because that would just be rude. And I think one of my concerns going forward is, like, what does protest look like now that the bar has been shifted in this really quite extreme direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was because one of the things with 2003, we had the largest simultaneous anti-war march in history, talking about it as being a global movement. Vietnam War, I think the protests wouldn't have been simultaneous because communication was so much slower. But by 2003, the world's all connected via the internet, and even though we don't have social media yet, we have listservs and things, and this global thing can be coordinated. But you can have this massive global outpouring of indignation about the invasion of Iraq, and then Iraq gets invaded and occupied, and 600,000 people die, and it feels like, well, we did it, we did the civil disobedience. Why didn't it work? and maybe that is something that's led people to think, what are some more significant protest actions we can take, and really being more disruptive than just having a march through the middle of a city on a Saturday and then going home. It's like, well, what if we actually occupy a space or occupy a building or so on. So yeah, I think you can maybe trace that thread right back to 2003 as to when protests started becoming more disruptive and more militant by 2011.
If you look at, it's interesting when you look at the idea of like protests being neutered. Like 2003 was just crushing for so many people, but also
we were in London for that.
I was on Oxford Street when we got kettled by the cops. I will always remember this. There was a guy who got on top of a double-decker bus and then just stripped off. Swear to God, funniest thing I've seen in my whole life.
Was it anything to do with the protest, or was it just
I don't know. He was just having a ball. Not? But we were at this intersection on Oxford Street, and the police were boxing us in, and there were some apartments above the shops, and a guy opened his window, went "Oi!" and looked out, and then he put these massive, the old wooden stereo speakers.
Oh yeah.
He put one in each window, and then started to blast out Edwin Collins' "War" as loud as he could, and
Nice.
Everyone, we are all dying.
Yeah.
We are all cracking up, and then we look up and they're just like, "Oh, this isn't funny anymore." But you think about it in the white Anglosphere protest kind of being neutered for a long time. It's a very an English speaking thing as well, I find, because in England especially, there is a thing where they're just like, well, the French wouldn't put up with this, because when the French go on strike or when they march or something, they are, minimum we're looking at 10 cars being burned out,
firefighters fighting the cops, that kind of thing.
Just you see that. And also the Arab Spring protests in Egypt and other places. These were genuine popular uprisings of the sort which are simply not allowable in Western capitalism. You're just not allowed to do it. I mean, if you look at, we talked about the Black Lives Matter protests 2 years ago, and the fact that Joe Biden yesterday in the State of the Union was like, no, we don't need to defund the police. We need to fund the police. And it's basically the state saying, yeah, you might have a point, but fuck you anyway. You said, it's wrong to, people see it as, it's wrong to disrupt the normal operations of society and the state if there is an injustice. And it's just like, it's funny because the state never has any problem with disrupting our lives through various economic and social means. But the minute you go, hey, wait, cut that shit out, they get really annoyed. And this isn't related to the most recent protest, which has been, a horror of, everything that people have been warning about coming true at once. And yet there is a kind of, you're allowed to protest, but not too loudly. You're allowed to march, but only along this line from A to B. Disrupting how things work won't get you anything. And the examples when that does change, like Ihumatao, they got mostly what they wanted out of doing an occupation. But like you say, like Occupy Christchurch, that occupation wasn't on State Highway 1. It wasn't blocking the road to the airport, because if it had been, wouldn't have lasted a week.
You would still be recovering from the head injury that the police would have given you.
Yeah. I'd have been bounced off State State Highway 16 a couple of times. But again, it's this, almost like modern capitalism in Western nations is just like, no, we've got protest on lock because what else are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of it just talking about all this. There's a quote from Howard Zinn, who's one of the historians who I think inspired me to study history, and I've looked it up so I can get the full quote. But he says, "Our problem is not civil disobedience. Our problem is civil obedience. Our problem is the numbers of people all over the world who've obeyed the dictates of the leaders of their government and gone to war, and millions have been killed because of this obedience." And that's something that's really inspired me. It's like, that's not, it can be more harmful to be obedient, to not do the disobedient protests that may actually end the war. I mean, if people had done more than just these big celebratory type marches through city squares, I mean, it could have been a more action that would have actually stopped the war in Iraq. I mean, I don't know. You're taking on the world's largest military superpower, but it's not. It's possible if people started to think, well, we've done these marches, where do we go from here? And that was another interesting quote that came up from one of the people I interviewed in the oral history of Occupy, who said, we march because the civil rights movement taught us to march, but marching isn't necessarily sort of winning us anything. And she had came along. She was not one of the younger people, but someone older than me, who had came along to Occupy because, like, hey, we're trying something different now. It's not just a march. Because I think even by 2011, having gone on my first march in 2003, I'd gone on a lot of marches and a lot of pickets and things in those intervening years, and you do get a bit demoralized because you can go marching every weekend, and that doesn't actually change anything.
Yeah, and I think it creates that one thing that we've seen in the rhetoric recently has been around, well, if you're against this protest, then surely you're against all protests, or if you're for this protest, you must be for, like, almost as though it's a hobby rather than an attempt to actually move the needle on something. I just think what you're saying about the Iraq protest and what could have, what we could have done differently. And I'm reminded of those, the Scottish Rolls-Royce engineers during the Pinochet regime who found out that some helicopter parts and things that they were assembling were for his regime. So they just they went on strike. They were like, we're not touching these, and we refused to work on them. And they sat on, they sat in the car park of this factory on shutdown until they rusted to pieces. And there was a again, another oral history about it in a documentary called Ne Passaran, which I'm a big fan. I love that name. But just that, it was that kind of direct action that yielded real results. If they just said, well, we're going to have a march, then nothing would have happened. But they put their lives on the line, and it was only because they had a strong union that prevented them all from just getting sacked and replaced that was able to happen. And it's interesting how we've seen the dismantling of that kind of collective action, which has sort of led to us, like, other things being neutered, like the ability to do things like strike in that way, and to refuse to work, and to actually do stuff that might have more of an impact than, as you said, sort of marching down the street every Saturday.
And that could be the sort of thing that could have potentially stopped the invasion of Iraq if enough people who worked in the the manufacturing of some of this equipment or in the logistics or whatever, if people say, we're not going to deliver, we're not going to drive the trucks to deliver this, or we're going to block the ports, or we're going to block the airports or whatever, and that kind of direct action, it brings me back around to some of our current political issues as well. This is something I did talk about. The podcast I was on last week that I mentioned is the one that the Canterbury Socialist Society does on Plains FM. So we got to talk a little bit more about the broader politics of it, and talking about that kind of action from organised labour. Something that I see as really encouraging is the union that's formed at Alphabet, which is YouTube's parent company. And while they're talking about their own economic interests, of course, they are also saying, we have a problem with how YouTube has been used to spread so much misinformation and disinformation. And I bring this up because there are differing opinions on the left around a lot of this stuff. I've seen a kind of free speech absolutism that is, no, we can't have any kind of censorship of social media because we can't allow the state to decide what is and isn't the acceptable political discourse we can have online, or alternatively, we can't allow these unaccountable private corporations to determine what the barriers of discourse are. And I think both of those make good points. But if you have an absolutist position that anyone should be able to use these platforms for anything they want, you are effectively saying that working people should be required to build and maintain the platforms for fascists. And I think if the union at Alphabet was strong and it was the whole company rather than just it'll be a minority of people there, unfortunately. Hopefully it'll grow. But if they actually had enough collective power to say, no, we're not going to allow this tool that we've created to be used by people like Lawrence Southern and Stefan Molyneux and others. But because they're lacking that power, most of the discussion that we have around censorship or regulation comes down to either corporate control or state control, because we're so far from having that organized labor at that level of strength that it's just kind of not even thought of in that conversation. And I think that is actually a big part of how we stop the spread of misinformation and disinformation, is if working people are empowered to have some control over the platforms that they build and maintain.
Is that the kind of community role that needs to be there? It's like you say, we've got so used to corporation will do it or government will do it, because the institutions of the people, he says, slowly raising a red flag in the background.
That's where that went.
Have been like deliberately degraded to further the needs of atomizing people, so that everyone accepts low wages and globalization, but not in a like triple parentheses globalization way, but in a globalization as it's actually happened kind of way. It is without those, it gets very difficult to. It gets very difficult for people to imagine that they have any kind of control over their lives in many ways, and that can lead to unexpected outcomes, like a convoy of trucks going from Bluff up to Picton and then getting stopped because they forgot there was water up there. You know, you kind of these things, like you get these unexpected things, and the state, I think we talked about it on a previous podcast, it's like the state doesn't recognize the threat because it's not been used to this kind of threat. But it's like the state itself has created it by seeing worker power as a challenge to its legitimacy. So they got rid of worker power and said, cool, there are no problems now. And then suddenly there are problems, and they're like, help me, community. And the community is like, don't ask me, mate.
Help me, cops. Yeah.
We did have some questions come in. I think you saw.
I saw a few of them in the Twitter replies, and held off replying on Twitter to save them for the podcast.
Okay, so Tamsin, a Midnight Voyage, has asked, what are your top 10 tips for like mental health safety in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think one thing that allows me to do this work is, you know, I am coming at it from a relatively privileged position, being someone who is Pākehā, who is male, who is straight and cisgendered. So while I see some quite awful things said about other groups, and it is offensive and upsetting to see people saying these terribly racist or transphobic or misogynistic things that you see in some of these spaces that I'm in, monitoring these people. As somebody who hasn't had that, that personal experience of that kind of oppression, I think I am in a position where it's not going to affect me the way it may affect someone from a more marginalized group. And I think people who are from those marginalized groups, have a really important role to play in the movement against the far right, because I really don't want to be speaking over any of them or speaking on their behalf. But I think that people who are from a privileged group have a role to play too, because we can, maybe dive into this stuff as somebody who doesn't have the lived experience of having to be on the receiving end of it. I mean, I get terrible things said about me now, and I get threats and things, but I mean, I've talked about how, I've had to work pretty hard to get those threats. Whereas for somebody who is like just existing as a visibly Muslim woman, they get a lot of the stuff that I get just for existing as the person they are. So, so for me, I do have that little bit of detachment, which I think means it's not going to be as a negative experience for me as it would be for someone from a more marginal group. So because of that, that's one aspect of it anyway. Yeah, I
think that's a really good point, Byron. One of the things that I've sort of noticed, it's extremely hard to go up against people who fundamentally do not see your humanity. And again, I'm lucky. I'm white, middle class, a little bit older. Trans, but scare quotes pass for all what that's worth. But yeah, there's still people who morally want to mandate me out of existence, and it's very difficult to deal with that kind of rhetoric when they're talking about me. So as you said, that level of detachment is, I think it's a really important part that people can play, and it's not necessarily talking over them. It's just it's you've got a shield, you've got some space that those other groups do not have.
This one comes from Fayasina down in Otepoti, and it's how did you get interested in this mahi?
Well, I guess set the record straight that I've never been really interested in Nazis. People when they learn I've got a history degree and that I write about the far right, they're like, oh yes, you must read all these, because they think it's the difference between historian and history enthusiast dad.
Have you read this book by Professor David Irving? Oh God.
People, obviously, the Nazi regime and World War II are a part of history that a lot of people are really interested in, even if they're not, you know, academically trained as historians. It is, and I think, you know, in some sense, you know, good, because I think we need to know that history, particularly the history of the Holocaust and the history of you know, the oppression that went on with that and what led to that and things like that. So I think it's good that people are interested in that. But when I studied history at Canterbury, I didn't do any of the papers on Nazis. I did a lot of New Zealand history in the first year, and then I did a bit of like British Empire and a lot of like post-colonial stuff, so like, you know, early mid 20th century. So people often want to talk to me about Nazis, and then are shocked that I'm not as fluent in the history of the Nazi regime as they are, because they're not a historian, but they, you know, read a book on World War II every year or whatever. Yeah. So I didn't get into it because I was interested in Nazis. What I think got me looking at the far right began in 2014 with Gamergate. And if listeners don't know, or if people don't know, Gamergate was basically an organized harassment campaign, a loosely organized harassment campaign of women who either worked in the video game industry or were video game journalists or wrote about video games. And in a weird way, it's you know, as a historian, you can trace the modern far right back however far you want, but definitely a key point is Gamergate, because you had these young men online who, you know, weren't active politically at all, but suddenly were organizing themselves in a way to, you know, harass and harm a group that they decided that they didn't like, because they saw that group as a threat to the kind of privileges that they had. And what a lot of the people involved in Gamergate felt was that they felt like they were a marginalized group because they were a bit nerdy or whatever, or because you know, they and often they were somewhat economically marginalized. We're talking a lot about like men in their, you know, maybe their early 20s, but who haven't got the kind of economic success that previous generations would. So, you know, rather than getting their house and their wife and the kids and stuff and their career, they're instead, you know, living with their parents, playing video games.
The kind of the post 2008 people.
Yeah, the post 2008 people. Yeah,
everything that I'm assuming, like, all of us as like kids born in the 80s were promised, we just about kind of got. But there's that generation, like the Zoomers, like some of those like very early Zoomers, kind of hit the period where you're meant to be able to get your degree and get a job and stuff, and then
this is what they took from you.
Yeah, then got absolutely nothing, and there is an intense sense of rage about that, which they directed at women video game reviewers and women coders, I seem to recall.
Exactly, yeah. So these young men sort of felt, you know, all that I've got is this fantasy world that I escape into, and now these women are trying to put politics in my video games, or put, you know, it wasn't a reactionary political movement as such. It was more just like politics as a concept, like keep it out of it. And of course, nothing is apolitical. And there's this meme I see shared around that, you know, for gamers, there are two genders, male and political, two races, white and political, you know, two sexualities, straight and political. Like, yeah, but yeah, and it was a time where video games were starting to be taken more seriously, because I think even by that time were, you know, the biggest entertainment product, bigger than movies and music, and starting to be taken a bit more seriously as, you know, as art and storytelling as well, which is why you'd get Anita Sarkeesian doing a series looking at you know, sexist tropes in video games.
Yeah, I remember that video series.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that Gamergate really, you know, really jumped on, was like, you know, how dare she, you know, criticize, and whereas I just saw that as you know, video games maturing as a medium, and that now we'll get this kind of same sort of cultural criticism that we get of, you know, of books and of movies and of television. But yeah, that really riled up the men who would become Gamergate. And then So I saw not friends as such, but certainly acquaintances who even got caught up in this. People who I might be friends with on Facebook because I met them at a mutual friend's wedding or whatever, suddenly are posting all this stuff, and I'm like, what are you on about? It's just a woman reviewing video games or whatever. And yeah, most of those people have unfriended me. I think they all have, actually.
Yeah, I remember because I remember that, and I remember the intense response to, especially like the feminist frequency or Sarkeesian videos. Like, I'm not a gamer at all, but I was watching them because I was interested in this feminist critique, and just the vitriol, and you can see how that kind of became an entry point for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I so I got interested in that kind of watching that phenomenon, especially as I saw, and this is something I know more about now than when I was watching it at the time, because it is something that has been written about. There's a book that's really interesting called "It Came from Something Awful."
It was like when Lotax died earlier this year, and suddenly everybody pointed at it and just went, "Oh yeah, he's the guy who banned hentai and created 4chan, and then Trump got elected."
Yeah, there's that meme with the dominoes, and it's like Lotax bans hentai.
Yeah, there's a lot of people I know who were goons, and in the aftermath of it, were doing podcasts about it, saying people don't realize how much of modern internet culture came out of those forums, but also all of them are just like, but that is a hive of scum and villainy.
Yeah,
it's just a completely. They were like, this place is horrible, and it was run by a complete piece of shit. However, the way the internet looks, is in part because of how something awful worked. Which isn't good. It's not good.
That's fascinating though, because as you said, just going back to what you're saying at the start around that, like the recording of history and the things that get missed, and it's weird. Yeah, I think we're all about roughly of an age now. We remember what, like the first internet and things, and the effect that it had, and how the ripples of that are just being understood now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so yeah, the found the full title of the book. It Came from Something Awful: How a Toxic Troll Army Accidentally Memed Donald Trump into Office. And so in that book, he traces everything from the culture on Something Awful through 4chan to 8chan, and so this is talked about a bit in there. And also another one I'll recommend, which is Joshua Green's book about Steve Bannon, called Devil's Bargain: Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storming of the Presidency. So in both these two books, it's talked about how Breitbart News, of which Bannon was editor at the time, saw Gamergate and saw like, hey, this is a core group of angry young men who can be used for my reactionary political movement. And he made the conscious decision of employing this flamboyant tech blogger, Milo Yiannopoulos.
Fucking prick.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I've been on Twitter for a long time, and I remember when he was a tech blogger, and he was a prick then.
He was just that kind of like mean and nasty sort of blogger that was around and Bannon saw him as a way to bring in the Gamergate young men, and so he was given this column on Breitbart, where they'd be the only media site that would provide sympathetic coverage of Gamergate, because the mainstream games press was like, what the fuck, dudes? What are you doing? Because the mainstream games press was, was evolving with the medium. It was, they were some of the ones doing this more critical journalism and things. And then the more mainstream media outside of the games press was just like, what the fuck is going on? Video games, we don't know. Whereas Breitbart,
that's fucking nerd shit. We're not.
Whereas Breitbart was like, yes, Gamergate is morally right, and they're fighting the good fight on behalf of these oppressed young men against feminism, and that was a real way that a lot of, I guess, my generation, a bit younger than me, but like that sort of cohort was brought into a new kind of reactionary politics. So watching Gamergate unfold, and then seeing that happen kind of in real time, and then by 2016 Donald Trump being elected, not entirely because of this like online subculture of misogynistic men, but very much that was very much part of it. That was a big part
Yeah.
of it that, you know, we shouldn't ignore. So I sort of watched that, and then with the rise of Trump, the real rise of xenophobia in the United States, but concurrently with that, there was a real rise of xenophobia in Europe as a reaction to the global refugee crisis of 2015, sorry.
Which we can absolutely tie back to the failure to stop the start of the Iraq War in
Yeah,
2003.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you're getting these far right parties in Europe as well. So I'm paying attention to the news overseas, and then we get the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, where a counter protester is mowed down by a car, and then 2019 we get a far right terrorist attack, a few kilometers from my house, and it was at that point where, you know, people who knew me kind of knew that I'd been keeping an eye on this world and started coming to me for insight, the way a lot of journalists are doing now. But back then it wasn't journalists, it was just people I knew on Facebook or whatever. And I decided that a way to get information out would be through the video essay medium, because I was, watching BreadTube, people like Harris Brewis and Natalie Wynn and the guy who does 3 Arrows and these things. I don't have enough time to keep up with a lot of it now, but I was now that I'm doing my own videos, but I was watching a lot of those and thinking, this is a way to communicate some of these ideas that's better than just writing, because there's so much information online that, you can write a really good article. You can write a really good, like 1,500 word article, but people are like, oh, that's a long article, and a lot of people won't read it, or they'll just read the headline. Whereas if you make that 1,500 word article a script, that's only like a 12-minute video, and people will watch a 12-minute video, and then they'll share it and things. So, so I started doing the YouTube channel, and that's grown a little bit over the years. And I do have another video coming out in a week or two. I'm just working on the editing.
I know what this video is about as well, and you're a bad man.
But this will be the first one in about 6 months, because as a result of doing the YouTube channel, I got other opportunities. Like I did some writing for David Farrier's website on my experiences with the far right, and on fake news in New Zealand, which is one of the real reasons I'm getting contacted so much by journalists lately, is that I was writing about counterspin media, when they'd only aired 2 episodes, and now they're this huge part of the fake news disinformation that's pushing this protest, and I was kind of there from the start, whereas a lot of people weren't. So I did that, and then from that I did a residency at Massey University. They have a program where they have an activist in residence. I did that.
I saw that, man.
And co-authored a white paper with Mohan Datta, and did some presentations there. Due to the pandemic, it was a remote residency, a bit of contradiction in terms. But I did that, and I've kind of been a little bit almost in the mainstream. I did have one article on a conspiratorial group targeting provincial voters, and that Newsroom published. So, I've been doing a little bit in between, and now I'm trying to getting a video out again after a big gap. But I'm also now writing a book about the New Zealand far right. So things have been building up for years, and then they started building up really, really quickly in the last 2 weeks because of what's happened, and everyone's trying to make sense of this. People in more kind of mainstream media who hadn't been paying as close attention to it, and
I think that's one of the things that I've found really interesting about this is you see people like you and Rangi Kamara and Anjan Brahman, and like there's been quite a few people who've been saying for a long time, here are these risks, here are these issues that we have. And just thinking like my own personal sphere, like the rise of sort of Gamergate, sort of linked to like the sort of Prosecco Stormfront that is Mumsnet in the UK, and the rise of transphobia, and that like how quickly that has gained, because that's another kind of fascism entry entry point.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, and to see how quickly people have been radicalized, and from there you start to see, for example, like our chief transphobes like reporting from the protest, and sort of these are very fine people, etc. And it feels like that sort of 2014, sort of 2015 was like a real like crux point for that. And it's just it's interesting seeing. I hesitate to use this whole sort of mainstream because I sort of feel like I'm using other people's language here, but just like seeing journalists who have been completely blind to this, and sometimes willfully. So I'm just reminded of Bryce Edwards sort of wandering around the protest site like, this seems fine to me, festival atmosphere.
Just ignore the noose over there.
I was actually thinking, like, obviously you have studied the far right and you focused upon them, so you know exactly who these people are. How does it feel to be like a good version of Bryce Edwards?
I guess it's an odd position to be in. I mean, I've met Bryce Edwards, a few times. Back before he was a commentator, when he was, still doing his like political science.
Back when he was a Marxist, eh?
Back when he was a Marxist, yeah. It's weird now that he's just got it so wrong on this issue. I mean, I'm sure it's not the only time he's been wrong, but I mean, he's so wrong. And I was asked specifically about Bryce Edwards when I was on. I think when I was on Media Watch, and it's like, okay, yeah, I'm just gonna have to say it. He's really wrong, and he is. And I mean, I haven't seen him say anything since the arson and the throwing bricks at cops.
He has been remarkably quiet. And I was linking back to something you said earlier about Steve Bannon seeing this kind of vaguely populist movement of angry young people and saying, I can see there is political opportunism in this. It's something that you could vaguely apply to certain members of the commentariat in the way that the politicians turned up, or I say a politician, Leighton Baker, failed politician, turned up. They were not looking to support the cause. They were looking to try and lead these people into their camp, or kind of use them as some kind of starting point for some kind of anti-authoritarian, kind of anti-government movement that just couldn't eventuate because of the internal contradictions of everyone who was there in the first place. But it is that them seeing this protest, seeing the far right alongside anti-vaxxers and who are also the same people, along marginalized and disenfranchised people, and just going, hey, I'm the person to lead these guys, or I'm the person to do their PR for them. And there's kind of that very, not kind of worrying, but also that if you give the far right enough goes at it, they might get it right at some point. They probably won't, because as I have seen in your many videos, tweets and other stuff, these guys are all driving their own tiny little clown cars into each other. And then the cars fall apart, and then all the other clowns fall out, and then they all start hitting each other with large shoes. But kind of this is the...
You're right there.
I'm just sustaining a metaphor, don't worry. But it is that kind of, you see them and you're like, these people got given a chance by people who are very stupid. And I tweeted about it today, actually, because you went from like Trump in 2016 to 2019, but Southern and Molyneux in 2018
had
a fascinating, there are two effects of that, which was one, you got your free speech unions, you speak up for women, your Jordan Williams, Dr. David Kuman,
they're all
Ashley
the same
Church,
people.
all of like it's just Jordan Williams in a variety of hats and mustaches at this point. You had them on that side, and they started to institution build on the right to give respectability to these horrible bigoted views. But equally, the other response was what I saw up in Auckland was the Auckland left stopped arguing with each other, and the sun came out from behind a cloud and it was a rainbow. But that carried on after there was unity saying, no, fuck these guys. At Ihumatao, you had groups who had spent years arguing with each other, all manning the barricades together, and you just kind of saw that as okay. And there has been a similar chat on the left around these occupations and what do we do about them. And because of COVID, the overall response has been, we do nothing because we don't want to be responsible for spreading the virus. And yet, it's that kind of 2018 was a point where things started to develop on the right, which means that there is a bridge between the National Party and counterspin media. there are stepping stones, and some people who are involved in the National Party will go and, will be members of the Free Speech Union and will be members of Speak Up for Women. And then some people from Counterspin will start to join those organizations. And at that point, you get this kind of horrible land bridge.
Yes, is that what it looks like from your perspective?
I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, you see this continuum on the right. I mean, when I was young in the 2000s, we had the National Front. Especially in Christchurch, where I'm from, where I still live, we had these mostly young men who would, shave their heads and put on Doc Martens and occasionally assault international students and refugees and do lots of really horrible things. And then there were people like Kyle Chapman, who tried to turn them into a mainstream political movement, but it was never going to happen because it was these thugs who assaulted people. And the far right then was, it was the skinheads who were visible and who were violent, and no politician would, try and, no politician would ever go to a National Front rally and be like, oh, why isn't the government engaging with these people? Whereas the far right now is different. It's a lot more respectable looking, to the point that you can have a protest like this one outside Parliament, and people like Rodney Hyde and Winston Peters can turn up thinking, oh, hey, this is an organized group of people who, could be advantageous to have on my side for my future political aspirations or whatever, whether that's those two I mentioned, former MPs, or whether it's people outside Parliament like, Leighton Baker and some of the Tamakis obviously are really involved in this in another way and seem to have some political ambitions too. Nobody would have done that for the National Front, but for the far right now, people will do that. And like the New Conservative Party is one of those ones where it straddles the more extreme fringe and, it's kind of mainstream respectability. Like they're still outside Parliament, but they're not. We don't look at the New Conservative Party the way that we look at the National Front. Even though if you go and look at the actual Conservative Party policies, it's like they read handmaid's tale and said, oh, this sounds great, let's do that. So it's a very reactionary movement, and they've brought in people like Dewey de Boer, who's on their board now, who's somebody who after the Christchurch shooting told Stuff that there are overlapping goals between his movement and the Shooters Manifesto. And so
he's the guy who got was it the advertising standards people or someone, or the press council were just like, no, you are far right.
Somebody complained to the media council or might have been Broadcasting Standards Authority about him being called far right in the media, and the authority came back like, well, that's an accurate description of your politics. I mean, I wouldn't call him a neo-Nazi because he's not. It's a different set of politics, but far right in terms of this is how far you are from the center of politics is, it's an accurate descriptor. So New Conservative, you got people like that, and but then you got the more moderate people from the Colin Craig era, and then when the New Conservative is polling at like 1 to 2%, more mainstream right-wing parties start thinking, hey, I'd like to have an extra 1 or 2% of the vote. Maybe I should be appealing to that group. So you get people like David Seymour saying things that energize the far right. So like when he went on Talkback Radio and called Golly's Garham a menace to freedom, and when he accepted a donation from Mike Allen, who had not that long before threatened to destroy mosque after mosque until I'm taken out. It's this, appealing to these groups as they see, some potentially just amping up their vote enough to get an extra MP or something. But in doing that, they are legitimizing some of these ideas on the far right. And so I see that spectrum going from the radical fringe to the New Conservatives to ACT and, national as well. The big example from a few years back, that was the topic of my first video essay, was the campaign against the UN Migration Compact. And that was started by far right groups in Europe based on misinformation about this obscure UN agreement that was really just a cynic would call it virtue signaling. It was just like, let's affirm our existing international law and agree we're all going to keep following that. And it came out of the refugee crisis. But the far right in Europe pushed the idea that this was going to be the United Nations is going to force you to open your borders, and you're not going to be out, countries won't be able to be sovereign and stop people coming, and we're just going to get flooded. At the extreme end, you had great replacement style stuff coming into that, and that movement spread to New Zealand, and the rallies at first were these more fringe groups. People would speak from the likes of the New Conservative, and then when they got a little bit bigger, ACT would send a speaker along, and then ACT would adopt the position of opposition, and then the National Party under Simon Bridges came out in opposition to it, and
they had the petition, didn't they?
They had a petition on their website, which was basically a copy of a petition started by Carol Saiki. It was a YouTube personality who made videos about how there was an Islamic takeover underway and things like that. And she'd done the original petition to Parliament, which only got about 6,000 signatures. It wasn't huge, but because the National Party adopted it, it became this more, it entered mainstream politics, even though it had come from the far right fringe. And it's maybe been buried a little bit since, because when the Christchurch shooting happened, the shooter had written on one of his guns, "Here's your migration compact."
He absolutely did. I remember seeing it, and I just remember seeing it, my blood went cold, and I was like, well, there have to be consequences for this, surely. And there were also references to Rotherham in the UK, which has been another one of these touchstones for the far right, and very Greater Serbia things in relation to the Bosnian genocide. But like the right memed this into existence, but they said, here's your migration compact. And there were never any real consequences for that.
There weren't, because the National Party removed that petition, but while the bodies were still warm. Essentially.
It was an emotional junior staffer.
And there was that whole thing. It was an emotional junior staffer who did it. And then we later learned, it's not really a junior staffer. It's a former press secretary who's worked there for 6 years. And I think he did resign over it. But he was the only head to roll over that. And this was just a staff member. Bridges isn't leader anymore, but there was no challenge to his leadership over, adopting this far right disinformation campaign and making it, a policy platform. And that really gives an example of how there is this continuum on the right, from the more mainstream right to the far right. And the far right can, through these kind of memes, not memes like funny pictures online, but memes like these ideas, they can push that into mainstream. And they did that using social media and using talkback radio. News Talk ZB was a big vector of this disinformation, because people would call in and say, I'm opposed to it. It's terrible. Have you read about this? Have you seen this? And they put on their website an article called, it was something like "Majority of Callers Opposed to UN Migration Compact." And it wasn't so much an article as in a journalist had gone out there and researched this. It was just a collection of talking points from, including one person who said, I recommend people go on and watch this Stefan Molyneux video on YouTube. But News Talk ZB they're not counter-spinning, they're mainstream media. They lean to the right, but they're mainstream. But they became a vector for this disinformation. And I think even after the shooting, while there was a bit of pushback on National and ACT for hosting these petitions and things, we haven't really had a reckoning with the way that even mainstream politics can allow this disinformation to spread.
I think in that kind of thing about the majority of people oppose this thing based on a self-selecting sample reminds me of the Platform, New Zealand's newest right-wing adjacent thing, doing their I say adjacent, I say in the same way that I am adjacent to my house right now, being inside my house. But they did their polling of the people at Parliament, and they were like, well, 30% of these people voted Labour Green at the last election, and only 10% voted for National and all of this, which means that treating these protesters badly is bad for the government. And I've seen this polling be quoted in 2 or 3 places as a symbol that the people outside Parliament mean that Labour are going to lose 20, like a significant proportion of their support. And as you say, it's like a right-wing meme in that, yes, the information, the data they found says this, but as long as you strip it of all context, that group outside Parliament represents mostly like 75% unvaxxed people in a country where 96% of people are vaccinated. You know, they're people who are able to be there and do that. And yet there are a lot of political commentators, bloggers, just people going, well, this is, you know, they haven't listened to them and it's all bad news for Labour from here. And you're just like trying to combat that.
Yeah.
Like once it's been put out there, is very hard to say, well, yeah, it's because you have to say, yes, they did find that, but that doesn't show what they're saying it says.
Yeah.
You know? It's a deliberate thing.
Yeah. And I've seen that, like some of the commentary on you know, on these sort of things. It's this real like partisan horse race sort of stuff of, you know, who's voting for who and what are the polls showing, and it, you know, it lacks the depth that we really need to understand the influence of disinformation. I know, you know, if we assume that the poll numbers are accurate, what does it actually mean if, you know, 30% of people at the protest voted for Labour or Greens? It means that people can vote for Labour or Greens and still be susceptible to disinformation and still be radicalised into marching alongside, you know, the actual far right. It doesn't mean that, you know, it doesn't mean like, oh, it's going to be a bad step for the government to do this. What's that going to do to the next poll that comes? It's like, no, we've got to look deeper than just this surface level, like who are they voting for? We've got to look at, you know, what's motivated these people to be there, which, you know, the box they ticked in a polling booth 2 years ago. I mean, I'm not surprised that, you know, 30% of them voted Labour because like half the country did. So, you know, and what was, I guess, even less surprising is that there were disproportionately people who voted for those fringe parties like Vision New Zealand and New Conservative and Advance New Zealand. But yeah, I don't think it says a lot about, you know, what steps the government will take and how that'll affect them in the next election or the next poll. I think it says more about, you know, the influence of disinformation and how it's not just, you know, it's not just a fringe of people that can be affected by that. It can be people who were kind of middle of the road apolitical voters, you know, a couple of years ago. They can be drawn into this and radicalized into it too.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points. There's one about that lack of curiosity on the parts of lots of people. Like there's very little interrogation past, as you said, like you can get people saying any old shit and it's just sort of taken at face value. There's very little, well, why are you suddenly obsessed with this sort of very minor piece of UN legislation, which is going to not do very much because it's the UN? You know, why is this suddenly such a big issue for you? And also the lack of curiosity and the lack of consequences, the lack of, as you said, just that lack of reflection on the part of people who are then almost responsible for sort of stochastic terrorism is terrifying to me. And I don't know how you begin to counter that, because people seem so unwilling to either, let's say, hold them to account or get curious as to why that's happening.
There's also the thing about, we've talked about like the media and the idea of platforms being run like by people rather than by corporations or the state. This incuriosity in the media also extends to the media being unable to recognize when some of its own members or some of the people it goes to have gone very far off the deep end. So you will have like certain former politicians or someone who has got the ability to ring up a radio station, get a headline, ringing up and just saying, the Muslims stole my trousers. And Yusuf Zebbi will be like, my God, the Muslims have stolen his trousers.
Muslims are coming for our pants. Yeah.
Or, you know, say a columnist who did excellent work about dirty dairying, like completely going off the fucking deep end about trans people and is now equating Kirsten Hall at One News with Eva Braun, I saw recently.
Oh my God.
Wow.
And you just have to go, at some point, like this happened a while ago. And a lot of these people have wily coated their way over the cliff, but they're still holding up a sign with slurs on, and the media are going, oh, look, he's saying something, you know, rather than dealing with it. we should probably wrap this up because we're
wildly
going,
overshot on time,
and we haven't even talked about cool movies. So we're going to have to get back on at some point, Byron,
can
and do a John
sure.
Carpenter,
John Carpenter special.
Yeah, John Carpenter special, or
I'm
like
down for that. Yeah.
or just like Reagan era movies, and what are our equivalents these days? Because
The
I'm down for
PostingCast
that.
Film Festival or something.
Yeah. Anyway, before we go, Byron, is there anything that you want to plug or share with our vast array of listeners?
Not in particular. I mean, if you like what I'm saying, yeah, definitely find me on Twitter and YouTube, and yeah, give me a follow. I'll get that little dopamine hit of the extra number.
Yeah, and check out the new video that's coming out real soon. Anyway, Byron, it has been an absolute pleasure tonight. Thank you so much for making the time. And I know this is such a busy few weeks for you, so I really appreciate you giving up your evening to sit and yarn with us. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
You've been the first to go,